For 2 years now, we've been conducting a review into our pension provisions for ministers and for staff. And we're now at the place where specific proposals are being made for changes to these provisions. We've started a formal consultation process on this, and this video is part of that process. Our presenter for the video is Robert Ashurst, who brings with him 35 years' experience as an actuary working in the pensions industry. But he also brings with him 30 years' experience as a leader in Baptist churches.
Because pensions is quite a complicated subject, I thought it might be helpful to talk about some background basics. We'll start by just reminding ourselves of the various sources of potential retirement income that people may have. Most people will have a state basic pension, and for members of the Baptist schemes they'll also have the state second pension unless they've made a decision to contract out on their own right. Other people may have a contracted out pension from a previous employment. I'm going to be majoring in these videos on the Baptist schemes, but we also need to be aware that people may have pension from a previous employment before coming into Baptist ministry or working for one of the employers in the Baptist Union staff scheme. They may have a spouse who's got pension rights from their employment, and you may have other sources of retirement income. There are two schemes within the Baptist Union. The big one is the Baptist Ministers' Pension Fund, which provides what we call defined benefits. And I'm going to explain what that means in just a minute. Altogether, it's got about 2,500 members. That's the people who are currently contributing and others who have previously been in the scheme and are either receiving benefit or waiting to receive it when they get to retirement age. It's got assets at the end of 2010 of about £130 million, although we wish they were rather more than that. And the thing that is most unusual about the Baptist Ministers' Pension Fund is that it has got over 1,000 what we call participating employers. That's because each church is treated as a separate individual employer for legal purposes. The other scheme is the Baptist Union Staff Pension Scheme, which looks after the staff of the union, of the associations, of colleges. That's a lot smaller, only 172 members at the end of 2010, assets of just over 6 million, and 15 participating employers. I'm going to be talking primarily in this video about the Baptist Ministers' Pension Fund, but the changes that are proposed are very similar for the members of the staff scheme, and we will cover that later. There are two types of pension scheme which we need to talk about on this video. First of all, the defined benefit, or DB, pension scheme, sometimes known as a final salary scheme. In a final salary scheme, the promise relates to the eventual level of benefits to be provided. So, for example, in the Baptist Ministers' Fund, the promise is that for each year of service in the fund, a member will get a pension equal to 1/80th of their final minimum pensionable income. Now, although the actuary can make an estimate of the amount of contributions needed to finance that benefit, you never really know the true cost of providing it until the scheme has run to its final end and the last member has died. And so the level of contributions required can fluctuate, and sadly we've been seeing it going up in recent times. Because of that, if the investments of the fund do well, then it's the employer who benefits from that. But the reverse of that is that if the investments do badly, then the employers take responsibility for putting that right. One of the other distinctive things about a defined benefit pension scheme that sadly some people have been finding out the hard way in recent years is that if the employer runs into financial problems, it can undermine the security of the benefits that members have built up to date. The other sort of pension scheme is a defined contribution scheme, or money purchase as it's sometimes known. Now, the promise in that scheme is of a particular level of contributions, and what can change is the eventual level of benefits. The level of benefits will depend upon the amount of contributions put in, the investment returns obtained on the money which has been invested, and the terms on which the accumulated money can be used to buy pension when someone comes to retirement. As a result of that, if investment returns are good, then the member benefits. But if, on the other hand, investment returns are disappointing, then it's the member who suffers. In this type of scheme, if the employer runs into financial problems, the member's benefits built up to date should be secure and not affected. The Baptist Union has been undertaking a pension review for the last 2 years. That's taken quite a long time because it's been a very complicated process because of some specific issues that relate purely to the Baptist Ministers' Pension Fund. But let's just explain the reasons why the review has taken place. First of all, contributions increased following the actuarial valuations at the end of 2007, and increases in contributions came into effect at the beginning of 2009. The second thing that's happening generally across the population as a whole is that people are living longer, and that's particularly true of Baptist ministers. But what this means is that the cost of providing a pension for them keeps going up. I'm sure we'll all be well aware of the fact that with the credit crunch and all that, investment returns have been disappointing, and at the moment, with long-term interest rates very low, that increases the cost of pensions a lot as well. The final factor, which was a driver for undertaking the review, was changes made by government to what are called the employer debt regulations, which have significantly increased the risk to the employers from running defined benefit pension arrangements. It's meant that their commitment is effectively an absolute guarantee, and in the case of a charity, it effectively promotes the provision of defined benefit pensions to the same level as, or even above, the fulfilment of their charitable objectives. In undertaking its task, the review group has been faced with a number of challenges. In particular, it's been faced with conflicting objectives. Because as a review group, we would like to avoid cost increases for members or employers. We would like to minimise the adverse impact of change on members. And we would like to reduce risk for the employers. But unfortunately, if we move in any one of those directions, it tends to have the reverse effect on the other two objectives. And so it's been a balancing act to try and get that right. The Pension Review Group undertook an interim consultation with members of the schemes, with churches and with other employers at the end of 2009, and there was, from that consultation, a widespread recognition that the current arrangements could not continue and needed to be changed. Once every 3 years, the actuary to the pension schemes does a health check, carries out complicated calculations to work out how much money we need to have in the fund in order to meet all the benefits that have been promised up to date. And they then compare that amount with the amount of money actually in the fund. Now, sadly, of recent times, doing that calculation has revealed a shortfall. In the actuarial valuation at the end of 2004, that shortfall was just under £10 million. By the end of 2007, it had grown to 18 million. We now have interim updates on the health of the fund every year, and with the credit crunch and poor investment returns in 2008, by the end of that year, the shortfall had grown to an alarming £60 million. The position improved a bit over 2009. We were down to just below £50 million of shortfall, and improved again in 2010 to around 40 million. From that £40 million figure, changes in the assumptions that are going to be necessary in 2010 are likely to increase the shortfall to nearer £60 million. That's a very large and alarming number. And effectively, that is being guaranteed by the union, the churches and the other employers in the fund. Let's translate that shortfall into what's happening to contributions. You may well be familiar with the contribution arrangements that are happening at the moment, which came into force at the beginning of 2009. In the Ministers' Fund, the member pays 8% and their church 16%. What people don't necessarily recognise is that that 16% is made up of two parts. One of them is the part to pay for the current year's build-up of pension, and that at the moment is 10.2%. The other bit, 5.8% of pensionable income, is what is necessary to pay for the shortfall that was discovered at the last actuarial valuation. It was expected at that valuation that contributions of 5.8% of minimum pensionable income would pay off the shortfall over about 14 years. But of course, sadly, the position has got worse rather than better. Preliminary numbers from the 2010 valuation of the Ministers' Fund, and they are only preliminary, suggest that if we keep the fund as it is, the total contributions required from members and their churches is likely to rise to somewhere between 35 and 38 or 40%. We thought it would be quite unreasonable to ask churches to contribute at levels as high as 35, 38 or 40% of pensionable income, and so change was essential. Let me summarise for you the proposals that are being brought for changes which would take effect from the 1st of January 2012. The idea is to have one trust-based scheme which covers ministers, staff and church staff, so it's extending the potential range of members. It's proposed to have a defined contribution or DC scheme moving forwards. And as I've explained, it's intended that that should start on the 1st of January 2012. We can't do it any faster than that because of the need for consultation and all the steps that need to be taken before it can become live. And if we leave it any later than that, then the trustees will be asking churches for very unpleasant levels of contribution, and we have no desire to do that. One thing which I need to stress very strongly is that the benefits that members have built up in the fund by the end of December 2011 remain unchanged. The pensions law doesn't allow them to be changed, and we don't want to. And they will continue to be linked to members' minimum pensionable income all the time they remain in ministerial service.